So I just want to say good afternoon, welcome. It's good to see you all here. This is such a very special occasion. Before Craig Murphy begins his lecture, I wanted to take a moment to say a few words about Kathryn Davis' Wellesley class of 1928. Today's lecture is part of a larger celebration to honor and remember Kathryn, who died at the age of 106 last year. Kathryn was the quintessential Wellesley woman. Wherever she went, she had a positive influence on people and places. She had a zest for life and an insatiable appetite for learning. She championed a great many causes, and these causes were causes that were long before they were actually popular causes. It included global education, world peace, environmental conservation, and art. She was also most generous to Wellesley. With her time, she dedicated in service to the college and through her unparalleled philanthropy. I'm delighted that this lecture is only one of several opportunities this year for this community to come together to celebrate the ideals, values, and beliefs that Kathryn held dear. You know, Kathryn loved Wellesley. She came as often as she could, and whenever she was on campus, she enjoyed everything to the fullest extent. I always like to say that last November, just about a year ago, she came to campus, and she absolutely was determined to go out on the lake in a boat. And that posed a certain number of problems, but she was out there and she was having the time of her life. Just something she loved. So I'm now happy to begin this event. I'd like to introduce Craig Murphy, the M. Margaret Ball Professor of International Relations and Professor of Political Science, who will speak about Kathryn's work as a pioneer in the field of global governance.
Thank you. So for those of you who don't know me, I just want to say that I am a political scientist. I work in the field of international relations. I do historically oriented work on the study of international institutions. And what I want to do is talk about Kathryn Davis's work from that point of view. I want to thank the president, I want to thank Marianne Cooley, I want to thank Sulin Post, I want to thank the people who advertised this, I want to thank the various supporters, everybody who put the food out there, etc. I also want to thank the political science department and the Russian Area Studies program for delaying a meeting that was supposed to be happening at exactly the same time, so that various people could be here. And let me just start by telling you where I will be going. What I want to do today is to talk about a book, which was Kathryn Davis's doctoral dissertation in the field of international relations. And this is the inside cover of the book. It was originally published in Geneva. And I will talk a little bit about Davis first. Then I want to talk about the city of Geneva, where she both got her dissertation and what she's writing about. She was writing about the Soviet Union in Geneva, the League of Nations. I want to talk about her as a pioneer in the field of international relations, then say something about what's actually in the book, the content of the book, and then say something about how this book still resonated after 50, 60, 70, now 80 years within the field of international relations. And then finally I want to say some things about why the kind of analysis that is in this book is actually feminist, even though some might think that seems bizarre. And then finally a little bit of a so what, how things could have happened perhaps a little bit differently. Next slide. So, Kathryn Davis. Again, I'm sure pretty much everybody knows these things, but I will start with them. Kathryn Davis was born in 1907, which was an awfully long time ago, in Germantown, which is part of Philadelphia. She went to private schools, both Quaker schools and non-Quaker schools, as a good Philadelphian might. She came to Wellesley College, graduated in 1928. The next year she started doing a little bit more exciting things and went on a trip to the Caucasus and other parts of the Soviet Union, with Leslie Alvin White, who was a rather famous anthropologist, and for those of us who are in the social sciences, that has lots of resonance and meaning. She took a master's in international affairs at Columbia University in 1931, and 3 years later, she graduated with a PhD at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, which was one of the very few places in the world where people could actually study international relations in 1934. So she did some things after 1934. From 1934 to 1935, she worked for the Council on Foreign Relations. Then she stopped kind of doing professional work in the field of international relations, did some other things, became a philanthropist, and all of those kind of other things that are fairly full 106-year life. I'm not going to talk about much of that, but I am going to talk about this period up through 1934 and 1935. All right. Okay. To start, I need to talk about Geneva, and I need to talk about Geneva in this period from 1919 to 1934. So, everybody here probably knows that Geneva is one of the two places that is the headquarters of the United Nations, and that it was previously the headquarters of the League of Nations. But there was no particular reason in 1914 or 1915 that anyone in their right mind would have thought that Geneva would have become the capital of the world, as it was starting to be called around 1920. Because actually Geneva was a very kind of backward, well, okay, Rousseau had come from there, so it was an important place, right? But it was kind of a little tourist town on the very far western end of Switzerland. Not a terribly important place. In 1898, William T. Stead, who was probably the most famous writer on international affairs in the world at the time, wrote about how the city of Bern, Switzerland, in 1898 was the capital of the world. It was the capital of the world because in Bern, at that time, you had all of the major international organizations of the period. You had the Universal Postal Union, which is still there. You had the International Telegraphic Union. You had the International Railway Union. You had the International Patent Union, the International Copyright Union, and the International Labor Office, all sitting in Bern. Well, capital of the world. Why then does the League of Nations end up in Geneva? It's a fairly simple reason. It's a fairly simple reason. All of you who are citizens of the United States, of course, remember that the United States didn't join the League of Nations, even though it was kind of an American who spent most of the time thinking it up. Other great powers were not terribly involved in the League of Nations. Germany wasn't allowed to be a member. They'd lost the war. The Soviet Union was not allowed to be a member. They were crazy red communists. We were talking about the Soviets in Geneva, so that's going to be a little weird. They were not allowed to join the League of Nations. They were not invited. Another great power that was not there. Great Britain really didn't like multilateral cooperation. They were there, but they were what we call in international relations a declining hegemonic power. And one thing about declining hegemonic powers, like the United States say, right now, is that they actually don't like multilateral cooperation too much. They kind of like it when they're on the way up. They don't like it on the way down because they think, oh, it's other people just trying to grab stuff from us. So the British weren't terribly interested in this. So as actually Kathryn Davis says in her dissertation, she says, you know, basically the organization of the League, after it started, really was an organization about France. The organization, she talks about how the relationship between the League and the Soviets is really a relationship between the majority, active majority of the League and the Soviets. And the active majority of the League, from the very beginning, really was France. Why did the French want the League to be in Geneva? Because they speak French in Geneva, because it's a very close little train ride to Geneva from Paris. So all of the organizations except the Universal Postal Union move, they build a beautiful new peace palace, and suddenly the center of the world is in Geneva. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about international institutions is that most of us think about international institutions as being these places where people sit and talk all the time, right? We think about all those government representatives. But in Bern before 1919, in Geneva during the League period of time, also true in New York these days, lots of other things go on. There's a staff of international organizations, and the staff does two things. They have big fat conferences that they hold where groups come together and they agree upon new things, new agreements that will be new forms of international law, that sort of thing. So they run conferences. And the other thing they do is they do lots of research. They try to figure out how to solve problems. Well, the League was the same thing. It was an organization that was doing lots of research and was holding lots of conferences. The conferences were substantive. They resulted in things that were meaningful afterward. Because they resulted in things that were meaningful, lots of other people followed the organizations to Geneva. You started to have people who were activists, who wanted to change the world, wanted to make sure that those conferences were done in effective ways, at least from their point of view of what was effective. And who actually had people who were sort of intellectual types, who were doing externally, doing some of the work of the League, which was the research work. So to point out, there were Americans, despite the fact that the United States was not in the League, there were Americans who were in Geneva because of the League. And just to give two examples of women who happened to be from Boston at the time, who were a generation older than Kathryn Davis. Two of them went there. Mary Parker Follett, who was kind of a well-known graduate of Harvard, who was one of the founders of scientific management, went to the League to be in charge of something called the International Management Institute, which was a research institute for scientific management established by the ILO, the International Labor Organization. And Emily Green Balch, who had taught at Wellesley until 1919, went to Geneva and started to work with an organization called the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which opened up its little office about 300 yards from the Peace Palace, and actually in the same building where the International Railway Union had moved because they were no longer in Bern. Okay, so we'll leave it at that. Oh, and then I should probably say, one other thing that was going on is the League immediately became a cultural icon, even in the United States. So in 1934, this guy was invented. So right at the end of this period, so 1919 is there, this is 1934, this guy's invented, Superman. And what does Superman do? He does justice around the world and takes the Nazis and the Bolsheviks. To achieve justice, he's going to take them to Geneva, Switzerland. Okay, next one. All right, so now to say something about Kathryn Davis as a pioneer in a number of ways. First off, she really was a pioneer in the field of international relations. When I first met her, which was 30 years ago, in this room, I was a very junior faculty member and was sort of teaching. It was an uglier room in those days. And this little woman comes in that door there. And I start, I meet her and learn about her and this sort of thing. And I was astonished that she had gotten a PhD in international relations, because in 1983, the number of scholars of international relations globally, prominent scholars who were women, could be counted on your two hands. And the number that you could actually really know was maybe about 3 or 4. The field of international relations as a scholarly field was deeply, deeply sexist, more than any other social science. That's not true anymore. Now the economists have that. But anyway, in those days it was an incredibly deeply sexist field. It was a deeply sexist field because the professional fields associated with international relations were deeply sexist. Now, there weren't many women, believe it or not, in the foreign service. It was inconceivable that there could be a woman who would become Secretary of State. There were no women in the intelligence service, except for a few Mata-Hari types, and they were all mostly fictional. And there certainly were no important women running the military. In 1983, when I was teaching here, all 3 of those services in the United States, the U.S. Foreign Service, the U.S. military, and the intelligence services, there were court cases against them for their discrimination. There probably should have been court cases against international relations schools too, but there weren't very many women in this field. So she was a woman in international relations, but she was also a pioneer because she was one of the first scholars of international relations. The field of international relations, like many other social sciences, got its kind of organizational form right at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. The people who were involved in this field, initially at least, were primarily activist scholars, not trained in international relations per se, but concerned about problems. So the first professional association, which had an American branch and a British branch, was actually called oh gosh, I'm going to get this, I hope I have it written down again. No, of course I didn't. I think it was the Union for the Democratic Control of Foreign Policy. And in Britain, the person who was in charge of it was an economist by the name of John A. Hobson. And many of my British friends say that Hobson's initial courses on international relations taught at the London School of Economics were the first courses that were taught. The American Association was actually run by Emily Green Balch, who occasionally taught courses on sort of the same subject here, but she was an economist too. There really wasn't a field in which you could be educated, and so it's not particularly surprising that one of Davis's two professors, her most important professor, was someone from France, who was a historian of industry, who was the founder of this Institute for the Study of International Relations, Momentum. So as a scholar of international relations, she was sort of weird and new. But as an American scholar of international relations, it was a weirder and newer thing. When she was going to school at the Institute, there were very few, well, there wasn't any place, I should say very few, there really wasn't any place in the United States where you could get a PhD doing the study of international relations. There were a few places where international relations was taught as part of a larger set of political science, but not at a graduate level. At Harvard, it had been decided that international relations was not a subject for undergraduates. It wasn't a college subject, and it certainly wasn't a research subject. So at many, many other universities, it was decided that, of course, it wasn't a subject, it wasn't a research subject, because Harvard did it that way. After World War II, all of that changes when the United States is kind of running the world, and it's important to think about international relations. Her other professor was Pittman B. Potter, who Brian Schmidt, who is the living historian of the field of international relations, is most well known, calls Pittman Potter really the founder of the field of international relations in the United States. Pittman Potter had a lot of trouble keeping a job in the US. He taught at Wisconsin, he taught at Oberlin. Then he ended up going to Geneva, where they actually gave him a job for a long time. Eventually he was able to come back to the United States and teach at American University, a Methodist university in New York, in Washington, D.C. Why could he teach at American University? Because, as Robert Coffey, who's another historian of international relations at Barnard College, says, in the U.S., the only places that were really concerned about relations between the U.S. and other societies in a coherent way in the interwar years were schools that had a missionary tradition, particularly schools that were in the American Southwest. That, by the way, for all you Wellesley types, is why the University of Denver, another Methodist school, happened to have an international relations school that at the end of the war, Second World War, a Czech emigre by the name of Joseph Corbel, father of Madeline Albright, came to teach at Denver, because those were the kind of places where these things happened. So as an American, she was kind of weird. As a scholar of international relations, she was certainly a pioneer, and certainly as a woman in the field, she was a pioneer. Okay, Pittman Potter, you can't even find a picture of him. I mean, all you can do is find pictures of his books. Okay, there you go. Next one. Okay, now I want to say something about the book. So, quickie summary of the book. Davis did two things. She went out and looked at all the documentary record of the relations between people from the Soviet Union and the League starting from 1919. All of this documentary record recently has been, of all of the League, has been digitalized by the University of Heidelberg. So it's actually possible for an obnoxious professor like me to go back and figure out whether she'd actually checked it all. Because we can do that really quickly these days. And boy, did she get it right. I mean, she really found, I can tell you, she found all the records. And then she did interviews with a bunch of the principal figures. that were connected with that. The thesis of the book is that you see ever-increasing cooperation between Soviet officials in humanitarian and economic fields with the organizations of the League of Nations, even though they were outside of the League of Nations. And at the end of the book, she predicts, which turns out to be true, that the Soviet Union was going to join the League and would be a highly productive member of the League. Okay? The one place where the Soviet officials did not work cooperatively was with the International Labor Organization, which was dominated by the trade unions that were non-communist trade unions. And that was the one place where there was a real difficulty. There was also not that much cooperation in political and military fields. There's a further argument that says all this cooperation was rooted in Soviet gratitude for the League's help at the beginning of the period, in the 1920s. And then, of course, the really important thing is that this whole trajectory was completely unexpected. Because at the time that the League was formed, at the Treaty of Paris, there was a very deliberate attempt to keep the Soviet Union out. There was a deliberate attempt to try to overthrow the government of the Soviet Union. All of the great powers had intervened to try to overthrow the government of the Soviet Union. And the Soviets had exactly the same sort of feeling about what the League was. This is a poster from Soviet poster from 1920, which says "Capitalists of the world unite," and it talks about how the League of Nations is the League of Capitalist Imperialism. So 1919, League of Capitalist Imperialism, intervention against the Soviet Union. How do you end up having cooperation develop over this relatively quick period? Okay, how do you do it? You bring in a Norwegian. It's always kind of the answer. The beginning of the story is all about the failures of this guy. So this guy's a guy named Fridtjof Nansen. Does anyone know Nansen in the room? Well, I spent much of my childhood, not much, but 3 or 4 years of my childhood in Norway, so I know lots about Nansen. Nansen was a great polar explorer. He was on the ship Fram, which is on this 1961 stamp from the Soviet Union. Nansen, by 1919, was a great figure because he was kind of this great polar explorer, hero, courageous, wonderful person, and the League put him in charge of what we would now call the humanitarian activities of the League. So he did a whole bunch of things. Nansen was this very tall, handsome, big mustache guy, and he was in charge of things like repatriating all of the soldiers that were caught behind enemy lines in a variety of different places. And he did some of that work in the Soviet Union, because there were lots of soldiers that were caught behind enemy lines in the Soviet Union, including lots of French soldiers. He was quite successful in that, in bringing soldiers back from one place to another, and he wanted to make everyone in the League know how great the Soviets had been about that. So he started kind of proselytizing about how the Soviets had been actually better than the French in making sure that this happened in a kind of wonderful way. And he was kind of failed in convincing most of the members of the League that the Soviets were really wonderful in doing this, but he made the Soviets were really happy about that. Then in the early 1920s, 1922, 1923, there was famine in the Soviet Union after the Civil War, and he was pleading to the other members, to the League as a whole, to provide significant amounts of famine aid to the Soviet Union. That didn't really happen very much. It wasn't terribly successful. It was kind of a failure, but, you know, Soviets kind of liked it. And then the final thing that Davis talks about is that he pleaded with the League of Nations to help the Armenians find a place to settle after what we now describe as a genocide against the Armenians. The Soviet Union was really big on that. They were actually wanted the Armenians to have a successful place to because Armenia was controlled by the Soviet Union, among other things. Again, Nansen was not as successful in doing this as one would hope, but many in the Soviet Union thought of him as being wonderful for doing that. So this chapter ends with her saying, All of these failures did not tinge the feeling of the Bolsheviks toward the great humanitarian agent of the League, who courageously and undauntingly had gone into their plague-ridden, famished land to aid the prisoners, the hungry, and the homeless, blah, 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 blah. If anyone could have created Soviet respect for the League of Nations, this man, who Secretary General Sir Eric Drummond described as the friend of those who were the most suffering, should have been the one. But the Soviets, who refused to welcome him as a League representative, but welcomed him nonetheless, but not as a League representative, considered him, unfortunately for the League prestige, as not a League representative, but as Fridtjof Nansen. His vain efforts on their behalf in what that wasp nest of international intrigue, that's what they thought the League was, Geneva, fortified them in the distinction. He was merely and simply their friend. Emil Ludwig wrote, "If I've heard his name spoken in the Urals, it was held wholly just below that of Madonna, not Madonna, Madonna. Today they would be different, or Lenin. His death in 1930 brought mourning not only to his colleagues in Geneva, but to his comrades in Russia. The League's compassionate and gallant knight-errant's quest was over." Terrible. I mean, you know, the Soviets loved him, he wasn't successful, they didn't think he was the League, but, it's a great book, but, you know, they kind of learned something from this, that maybe taking part in those League humanitarian conferences wasn't a terrible thing. That there was this good humanitarian work that Nansen had tried to do. He hadn't been terribly successful. Maybe it wasn't a horrible thing for the Soviet Union to be involved in humanitarian conferences, creating humanitarian norms. And they were especially involved in the health conferences, conferences associated with narcotics, conferences associated with the treatment of refugees, treatment of foreigners caught behind lines. And actually, they ended up thinking that the use of gas weapons in war was a humanitarian issue, and therefore they actually took part in that conference and ended up signing the treaty that banned the use of gas, the League Treaty that banned the use of gas. One of the things that was probably the most important, and this is one thing that endeared the French to the Soviets, believe it or not, was health cooperation. Prior to the First World War, the French had tried frequently to get significant international cooperation on health issues. And they were stopped constantly by the British, because the British officially believed that the germ theory of disease, which was the theory that supposedly, you know, all this cooperation was going to be based on, because they were going to do things like have quarantines and that sort of thing. You have this theory of disease. The official British view, it's very much like the US with climate change. The official British view was that there was no science behind that. That disease was caused by miasmas, and the one thing that you would not do is stop shipping, 98% of which was controlled by, not 98%, 80% was controlled by the British. You wouldn't stop shipping by, you know, those awful quarantines. The French had been trying, especially because of the spread of disease in colonial areas, had been trying to work on cooperation of this sort for a long time. The flu of 1919 and these series of conferences ends up providing that kind of cooperation. And so, you know, this kind of, the fact that the Soviets were there at these things and you know, putting in their oar and helping did sort of improve relations a bit. So we have these humanitarian beginnings, and now we go a little further. The other thing the Soviets were really actually kind of interested in doing were really boring economic things. Really, really boring economic things. They were very interested in cooperating with the League on navigation and shipping standards, you know, like the amount of weight that can go into ships and things of that sort. They wanted to do, they worked on issues of counterfeiting, on questions of double taxation, on establishing an international wheat agreement that would stabilize the price of wheat globally. They even cooperated on creating a prospective European Union, a little bit, European Economic Union. And one of the things that Davis only kind of touches on, but that it was going on at the same time, is that the Soviet Union, because of these other things, especially the navigation and shipping standards, were cooperating constantly on the so-called private standard-setting regimes that were also going on in Geneva. So remember that building with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and with the Railway Congress Association? Sitting there is also the International Electrotechnical Commission. They're the people who figure out how to do radio standards and electrical standards. And one of the reasons that I've been thinking about this book a lot is that my wife and I are writing a history of this kind of cooperation. And last March, I was in the archives of this place in Geneva, and my wife was in a different set of archives at Stanford. And she was looking at a series of records from the mid-1950s where US and Soviet engineers, mid-1950s for you student types, that's like the height of the Cold War. Everybody hates each other. God, it was really bad. Mid-1950s. And US and Soviet engineers were sitting and creating standards for making sure that there wouldn't be radio interference with signals that would go into satellites. This is like 1955, 1956. There weren't any satellites yet. This is before Sputnik. US and Soviet engineers were having the space race. We're having the space race because we want those missiles to be able to go up to kill each other, right? It was a big deal. But yet all the engineers working on the side, on either side, were sitting actually in Stockholm, talking about how can we do these, how can we get better standards to make sure that when we're communicating with our satellites, they don't fall out of the sky, all right? And so my wife was doing this, and she sent me an email and said, you should look in the Electrotechnical Commission archives and see if any of these people had been involved in it before the war, Second World War. And so I went back in and found that, yeah, actually a whole bunch of them had been sitting in 1934 in the same Electrotechnical Commission in Geneva, working on the early aspects of this at a time when the United States and the Soviet Union were still supposedly hating each other. And yet this cooperation had gone on not only through the war, we were allies then, but had continued immediately afterward. So they were involved in this kind of private standard setting. I couldn't find a really good picture of one of the actual Soviet engineers, but I did find one of the Soviet interpreters, and I just love this picture because it's in the book where it's a Swedish book, and so it's translated from the Swedish, but it shows the great Swedish engineer talking with the Russian interpreter about they're going to be standardizing screws, about what his favorite screw looks like. This is very technical stuff. It's really simple stuff. Okay, I want to talk about the impact of the book. So this book, published, this is the edition that was published in Europe. There was a much prettier edition that was published in the United States, right as soon as the book was done in 1934, and I want to talk about the impact of the book on the field over the years. The immediate impact was that between 1930 and 1939, this book actually sold pretty well. It sold pretty well because it comes out after the Nazis immediately after the Nazis come to power in Germany. And there is this belief that you start to have in Britain and the United States that maybe the Soviet Union is a potential ally against the Nazis. This was a book that gave you a sense of understanding what these Soviet people were like, and it also gave you a story about how cooperation could develop. So copies of the book sell pretty well. It gets reviewed all over the place, not just in sort of political science places. It seems to drop off after 1939 with the Hitler-Stalin Pact. 10 years is a fairly long time, so maybe it would have dropped off anyway. But that, my interpretation of this being the reason that it was there, that it was read, I think is maybe right. In the 1950s and 1960s, you find citations to it again, and starting with work by Jacob Weiner, where the issue was thinking about how you could possibly create cooperation, economic cooperation between former enemies like France and Germany, who were going to hate each other forever, right? And it was really this kind of question about what would eventually become the European Union, and it was saying, well, look, we have this example of the Soviet Union, and maybe it's not going to be impossible. We know that there are these elites in France and Germany who want to have this unity. Maybe it won't be, maybe it'll actually be possible to make this work out. By the 1980s, you get a set of other references, but they're secondary references. There's key literature in international relations that refers to the story in this book and refers to people who cite the book, but doesn't refer to it directly, in two areas. One is there's a lot of work that's done by, on what's called the socialization of revolutionary states. How do you take states that really look like they don't believe in the international system and bring them into the international system? John Eikenberry, who's at Princeton now, and Charles Cupshin, who's at Georgetown, were perhaps the most famous for writing about this. So what they were thinking about were things like Deng Xiaoping in China. Can we turn him into a normal leader of a normal country? Can we make the Iranians normal? Can the US have good relations with Vietnam? That's kind of what the theory was. And then there was this kind of answer that said, oh, yeah, actually there have been examples of this previously. And again, it's a secondary kind of reference. But it also came in, there was a very theoretical literature in the 80s and 90s about cooperation in general, and what is sometimes called using tit-for-tat strategies to deal with prisoners' dilemmas. One of the great writers on this was a guy by the name of Anatole Rappaport, a Soviet-Canadian, Russian-Canadian. He said that the way you do this, the way you get cooperation, is you do something called tit-for-tat strategies. If somebody's bad to you, you're bad to them. If someone's good to you, you're good to them. But the thing that you need to do to make this work is somebody has to start out by being nice. And the story, the Nansen story, becomes a story that is the one is used as a description of how this can happen. Even if attitudes don't change at the first point, if you have tit-for-tat strategies there, you have it there. In the last decade and a half, suddenly you've got people actually referencing the book directly again in three different areas. One is people writing about national approaches to the United Nations of the very powerful members of the UN, and then writing historically about how there are aspects of the way Russia treats the United Nations that are the same thing as what was going on with the Soviet Union in the League period. You start having new histories of the League and of Soviet foreign policy. My friend Madeline Haren, who put together this digitalization of all the League records, when I was at a conference in Heidelberg with her a couple of years ago, one of the first things that she was saying is, oh, Wellesley must be so wonderful because that's where, Kathryn Davis went to school. So you must have this wonderful tradition of international organization. And then there are a lot of people who've gone back to this period and talked about so-called voluntary consensus standard setting, that boring stuff, and said, oh, we can go back to that earlier period and we can start seeing examples of what we see today in this kind of bringing of the Soviet Union into this process. So the book has had impact. It really has had impact over 80 years. Okay, that's the book, that's the impact, now's the exciting one. So the title says that I'm saying that Kathryn Davis is a feminist. And I think probably, I think that I doubt if she would have described herself in any way at the time as a feminist. But there's an argument in the field of international relations that I think makes it clear that what she did in the book was something that was quite feminist. So, I was giving you all that stuff about the reaction to the book, but I didn't give you the first review that appeared in the United States, which actually appeared in the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, which was where she was working. So I'm going to read you the entire review by William Langer, October 1934. The author neglects the political problem, being concerned entirely with the means and extent of Russian cooperation with the League. Okay, that's the review. And that review relates to this particular kind of analysis that comes from feminist scholars of international relations. So feminist international relations becomes kind of a field, goes mainstream in the 1980s. There's a big Wellesley College story related to that, but you'll start to get a bit of it even when I talk about this. And there's a distinction that's been made in a lot of feminist work that I think has been very key to the reason that this feminist approach has become extremely important in the field. And the distinction is made in an article by Bernice Carroll called Peace Research, the Cult of Power, which was in 1972, where Carroll says, you know, even in the field of peace research, which is where people are supposed to be concerned about peace, right? Scholars of international peace tend to think there's only one kind of power, and it is power as dominance, power as power over things, power as me beating up the demon. No. Or at least trying to defeat him in a soccer match. Power over. Later, but pretty much it's almost like 2 years later, a political theorist who happened to get her degree at Wellesley College named Nancy Hartsock talked about how power over is very much associated with hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity in this sense, that what men are told to be within many societies, we can do many other things as well, but hegemonic masculinity is associated with being a warrior. And warriors are all about power over. And it's not surprising, as Bernice Carroll says, that even in the field of international relations, even in peace research, men are doing their male standpoint as warrior and only think about power over. Carroll says there's this other thing, power to do, power to make things happen. Again, Nancy Hartsock says, well, you know, Hartsock is someone who's a materialist, and an economic materialist, but not a biological materialist. She certainly isn't someone who believes that there are things that are in our genes that change things. But she says, you know, women, because of the way our society works, frequently have to hold things together. They have to deal with all the messes. And having power to do, having power to cooperate to make things happen successfully is something that is not all that surprisingly connected to something that women frequently know how to do. The standpoint of just being a woman who has to deal with all the messes means that you actually think about the power that is associated with that. And therefore, it's not particularly surprising that feminist international relations is pretty much all about power to do. It's got some other things in it as well. I would talk about Davis as a feminist because she's all about power to do. I mean, you can imagine somebody, I thought what Langer really should have written was, the author talks centrally about the political problem, being concerned entirely with the means and extents of Russian cooperation with the League. Yep, that's really his power to do, if he had just changed what his evaluative words. I want to mention that these ideas of power to do actually existed on the edges of the field of international relations, even at the time that Davis was in Geneva. I'm going to go back to those two women. So Jane Mansbridge, another alumna of Wellesley College and current president of the American Political Science Association and probably one of the greatest democratic theorists, wrote a wonderful preface to Mary Parker Follett's book, The New State, Group Organization and the Solution to Popular Government, where she uses these distinctions, refers to Hartsock, and says, you know what Follett was all about? Follett, who is known as one of the founders of the field of scientific management, what Follett was all about was understanding power to do. And that in that sense, she was a feminist pioneer. And there are other places where you can look at this. I mean, Katia Convertini, who's in our Peace Studies program, has talked about the way in which, and really kind of going back to similar arguments that Bernice Carroll makes, but also talking about again, one of these people from Wellesley, Emily Green Balch, that power to do is a big part of how we need to understand a connection that can be made between feminists and peace studies. So it's because of this kind of analysis that I think that I would call Davis a bit of a feminist, even in 1934. Let me just go to the last two slides. So, when I read this book, you know what bothers me? Is that this really smart woman dropped out of my field. That's what really bothers me. I mean, she writes this, she goes to the Council on Foreign Relations, she works for a year, for some reason she drops out of that job. Maybe it's because people at Council on Foreign Relations aren't all that wonderful. She does other things, she makes a lot of money, and becomes a wonderful philanthropist. But I often wonder if there could have been people like her in the 1930s, whether my field might have been a lot smarter, a lot earlier. So some of the big things that are going on in the field right now is that we have a much better understanding of international cooperation than we ever had. And it's an understanding that comes from deep empirical work, but it's an understanding that is deeply influenced by feminist analysis. One of my favorite books is a book by a guy named Joshua Goldstein called Winning the War Against War. I impose it upon my students. And Goldstein is, a feminist scholar of international relations. You don't have to be a woman to be a feminist. There's also a lot more work on understanding revolutionary powers and understanding the ways in which revolutionary powers can sort of be moved into a different system. And there's also kind of an understanding of the ways, even the systems of authoritarian or totalitarian societies fall apart from within and how that connects to international affairs. Again, there are books by another guy who thinks of himself as a feminist, Matt Evangelista at Cornell, who's written quite a bit along this line. And wouldn't that have been great if we'd known that a long time ago? And maybe we wouldn't have been worrying as much about, say, Iran as we have for a long time. That had happened if we'd known that in 1980 rather than in 2012. And there might have been earlier recognition of the centrality of technical standard setting and the centrality of all that boring stuff, those screw threads and keeping the electrons out of space and all of that sort of stuff. So, and there's another feminist who's, I won't tell you about him. Anyway, guy. But I think about this and I realize that actually probably Davis couldn't have done. She made the right decision. Because I look at these people who were from the generation before her, those other two women, and I think about what they did and what they tried to do. Both of them were people who tried to create careers for themselves as scholars of the local and the global in universities as people who just did a bunch of research. So Mary Parker Follett, she, in one sense, never got a degree because in 1899, her undergraduate thesis, which is still one of the major historical works on the way the House of Representatives works, was an undergraduate thesis at this place called Radcliffe, and in those days you didn't get a degree when you got it, when you came out of Radcliffe. There were people in what became the government department of Harvard who had this strange idea that maybe she should be hired there, but that was insane. So of course it didn't happen. I mean, it just seemed ridiculous. But she did start to find out that there were private companies who liked her ability to think about how organizations work, both internally and externally. And she became an early consultant and, kind of one of the inventors of this field of organizational studies. Went to the International Management Institute, and now if you go to the Harvard Business School, she's one of the great Harvard-connected founders of this fantastic field. But it wasn't, the university didn't want her. She went into business. The other person is our own Emily Green Balch, who in 1918 did not have her contract renewed by the Wellesley Board of Trustees because you know, she was not getting good teaching evaluations because she was advocating peace and things of that sort. Actually, we don't know she was. But her contract was not renewed, and you know what did she do? She goes to Geneva, and you know, makes the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom into an organization that is of great significance. So, I think, last slide. So I think that even though I wish Kathryn Davis had stayed in my field, because I think my field would have been better, she probably did the right thing. And you know, this is her in the middle of all of these folks at Seeds of Peace, which is one of these organizations that brings together young people across horrible conflictual divides, and tries to get them to talk with each other and generate knowledge that might be helpful to their societies. There were things that were not open to Kathryn Davis. I've still been trying to find out if there is any other woman who did a doctoral dissertation and has received a PhD in international relations before her. Brian Schmidt, who's the major historian of the field here in the United States, says he can't find anyone. John Broome in Britain, who's the major historian of the field there, says he certainly can't find anyone. That doesn't mean there aren't people. The records of the Geneva Institute, she's the first woman to have done there. We can't think of too many other places to look. The University of Wales and Aberystwyth had an earlier PhD program. There's certainly aren't what they came up there. So she's a great pioneer, but I think she ended up doing good stuff, even if she didn't say anything. Thank you. And now, at least from here, I know some people have to go, but I can take a few questions if they're, no. Yeah. Bill, you're
I was very interested in how you described Davis working with the Russians and the Soviet Union, and I was thinking, did it ever get down to the point where she was perceived as an apologist for the Soviet Union?
Oh, yes. You can see this in the reviews of the book. You know, that she was perceived as someone who was, by at least some of the reviewers, including the American Political Science Review, as someone who was, you know, a befuddled young woman who's been convinced by all these terrible bullshit.
In the McCarthy era, too?
Yeah.
I don't know in the McCarthy era. I only know in that period in the McCarthy era.
No, I thought that's one.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, because in the 50s, when the book is being cited, it's being cited for a reason that's connected to theory, not a reason that's connected to the Soviet Union. It's being connected to questions about international cooperation, economic cooperation, and particularly international economic cooperation between highly antagonistic societies. So it's not being brought in, at least at that time, into, if you follow the citations, it's not being brought into discussions about the Soviet Union per se, it's being brought into a different discussion. So I don't know. Maybe she was, but you know, I don't know. But certainly in the 30s, yeah, she was, and she says at the very beginning, she has kind of a wry way of writing. She talks about how she admires both experiments, the Soviet Union and the League of Nations, but I am equally critical of both experiments, the Soviet Union and the League of Nations. And then it becomes very clear as you go through it, you know, ways in which she is critical of both. I mean, she's critical of the Soviet leadership for initially not being willing to deal with the cognitive dissonance of Nansen, who they love, who is incredibly helpful to Soviet society, being the representative of the League of Nations. She says, you know, this is kind of ideologic. She doesn't put it this way because she writes much more beautifully than I do and much more subtly. But it's like, this is really blinkered views on the part of the Bolsheviks. And when she writes about the League, the way in which the Secretariat of the League, that is supposed to be independent, a lot of people other than Nansen, are just doing the bidding of the French is, of the majority, quote unquote, she finds a little bit bizarre, and obviously thinks that is the way intergovernmental organizations have to work. You have to respond to the membership, and if the power of the membership is a block around the French, then that's what the League is going to be. But she has kind of a hope for a different kind of international institution. She wants a Nansen. She wants international institutions run on ground of we are solving problems and we get the best people who can do them to solve the problems. So Nansen is a hero for her as a League hero, not because he's nice, he does things for the Soviet Union, but he's a hero because he tries to make the League what it should be, an organization that does things, not an organization that responds to its members. So,
I wonder if she ever met Emily Greenwald. I know that Emily Greenwald had already left Geneva by this time she was.
yeah, that's right. So I have no idea. I was kind of hoping that her name was going to appear in the League of Nations database, and therefore when I did the little map from Emily Greenwald, that I would be able to see her connected. It's not connected. Certainly, Balch knew, and again, because we can go directly into that, that there were situations where Balch interacted with both Potter and with men too, with her advisors. But I don't know even whether they were physically in Geneva at the same time.
Yeah, I don't think that Emily Greenwald was in Geneva in the 30s. She stopped. She was Secretary General Wolf until 22, 20, something like that.
Right, and she went back and forth at other times, but she wasn't permanently sitting there. And she did come back to a variety of conferences, because you can see that in those records, as I say, digitalizing his research. But I don't know. I don't know.
Yes.
When Balch left Wellesley, when her contract wasn't renewed, that was the time when Wellesley required faculty members to sign kind of moral decrees of upholding Christian values, and still, I think they were still teaching required Bible studies daily.
They were teaching required Bible studies when, I'm sorry.
But in early days, all faculty members had to teach the daily Bible.
I would have
lessons.
loved having to do that. That would have been great. I could choose my part.
And I don't know, I don't know how many people, if that had anything to do with her leaving, that she wasn't willing to sign.
I don't know.
I don't think so, no.
Okay.
I think that it was a mixture because of her pacifism and because she was a socialist.
Okay.
Yeah. She was
Socialists would have.
So she was an economist who had been trained as a German historical economist,
Okay.
and she taught Marx. And it's even funny looking at her syllabus. She says, you don't have to read the first volume of Capital in German. The French translation is really quite good, and if of necessity you must deal with the blah-blah-blah translation into English, that's also possible. Wellesley must have been a really tough place back in those days, but she definitely taught Marx, and she was a socialist. I mean, she was critical of Marx. She thought the labor theory of value was idiotic. I mean, it's clear that she had a lot of things that she was certainly not a Marxist in that sense, but she was a German historical economist and a socialist. She also did all of these weird things. Well, she did all of these things that we think are brand new and wonderful, like having students study downtown in. And do things that look like internships. Anyway, it's all very crazy stuff. And anything else?
Talk a little bit about the circumstances of your meeting, Kathryn Davis. Is it in this?
Oh, so she was. I think she was a trustee. I was teaching. I was a new faculty member, not pretty new faculty member, and I was teaching international organization. And she showed up through that door because this was we go and look at a couple of classes, and I think she wanted to see who was teaching international organization and what I was teaching. So I think trustees still do that a lot. Actually, they kind of show up. That sort of thing. So yeah, it was kind of neat. And later, I've never been all that interested in Russia. I've done a lot of work with Russian scholars who work on international relations, but my wife and I own a cabin on Mount Desert Island, so we ran into her some other times after that. I was going to say that my really biggest reason that I think she's a really important person is that one of the places that she gave lots of money to on Mount Desert Island is the neighborhood house in Northeast Harbor, and the Austin-Acadia connection. Well, actually, there are two reasons why this is really important. One is the Friends meeting meets there, but the Austin-Acadia connection, which is the Texas music thing, is always at neighborhood house. So you know, I keep thinking, oh, this is really great. Okay, thank you very much.